"Sit down, you ghetto trash." That's what they told her. Loud enough to insult, quiet enough to deny. But Jasmine Crockett didn't sit. She stood, armed with nothing but an envelope, the Constitution, and enough silence to make a room full of suits sweat through their silk. In just 17 seconds, she connected a $12 million fund for wounded veterans to a marble mansion in Slovenia, owned by the son of a former president. No warrants, no headlines. Just a paper trail so clean it made the American flag blush. And the worst part? That money was denied to 214 veterans. The same week it bought a gold bathtub for a boy who never wore a uniform. This isn't just scandal. It's sacred betrayal. And it all began with one woman who refused to sit down. She didn't enter the chamber. She claimed it, like a verdict wrapped in heels and steel. Jasmine Crockett walked through those tall mahogany doors, not like a guest, not like a politician, but like justice itself had taken human form. Her posture didn't bend to the room's history. It dared the room to adjust to her presence. There were no shouts, no chants, just the sound of 4 deliberate heel strikes on polished marble that said more than 1,000 campaign speeches ever could. And in her hand, not a binder, not a tablet, but something far more dangerous. A thin brown envelope, ordinary in shape, explosive in consequence. The room was full, press, politicians, aides, but silent in the way only a loaded gun is silent. On one side sat the legacy, former President Donald J. Trump, arms crossed, chin tilted, that same smug grin worn at rallies, courtrooms, and cover stories. But something in his knuckles said otherwise. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She didn't have to. The moment she laid that envelope down on the desk, the air shifted. Veterans of hearings knew it. Journalists smelled it. And the lawyers in the back, they started typing before she even sat down, 17 seconds. That's how long it took for the atmosphere to change from posturing to panic. 17 seconds from envelope to earthquake. She adjusted the mic with clinical calm, an almost surgical gesture, and said just one line. "Let's begin by unpacking the weight America has refused to carry." And then she flipped it open. What tumbled out was not a dramatic confession, no smoking gun, just a single sheet of high-weight, watermark paper. But at the top, bold and unmistakable, read 2 words that caused a visible flinch from 3 different committee members. Freedom properties. The color drained from Trump's face like ink fading in water. His eyes flicked to his lawyer, who leaned in and whispered something clipped, urgent. Trump didn't nod. He didn't move. He just stared at the page like it was a death certificate with his name misspelled. That was when it hit everyone. This wasn't going to be political theater. This was an execution, done in legal ink and constitutional fire. The paper Jasmine held was a transaction log, plain and cold. $12 million, rerouted through a nonprofit intended to support wounded veterans, funneled into an EU shell company named Primorsa Holdings, based in Ljubljana, Slovenia. The memo line? Interior Procurement, Phase 3, Legacy Wing. The date? July 4th, Independence Day. Crockett let the silence sit. It wasn't awkward. It was intentional. It was the kind of silence that makes liars sweat and cameras zoom in. Then, without looking up, she unfolded a satellite photo. A sweeping white estate with marble pillars, a private dock, and a gold-gilded rooftop terrace overlooking the still blue of Lake Bled. "Would anyone here like to explain," she said, voice steady, unhurried, "how the word freedom traveled from a veteran's stretcher to a marble villa in Eastern Europe?" A ripple of shifting suits. One aide dropped a pen. Another pressed a thumb to his temple like he was trying to erase the moment. But Jasmine wasn't done. She tapped the screen and zoomed in on the photo. On the balcony, a young man in linen pants, barefoot, holding a tablet. The initials BT engraved behind him in black marble. No caption, no narration, just truth, pixel by pixel. Trump shifted in his chair for the first time. "That's a forgery," he muttered. Jasmine didn't blink. She brought up the next slide. Property registration forms. Slovenian government stamped, verified, irrefutable. Ownership, Freedom Properties USA. Use, faith-based restoration villa. Beneficiary designation, Legacy Youth Wing. She turned toward the committee. When was the last time any of you approved $12 million for a youth wing inside a foreign mansion? Silence. And then it landed. Not just the villa, not just the paperwork, but the sinking realization this wasn't isolated. This wasn't some administrative error. This was a design. She looked directly into the camera, not at the press, not at the committee, but into the eyes of the country watching from kitchen tables, VA hospital beds, and late-night news scrolls. America, she said, we denied therapy to soldiers while their money cleaned marble floors overseas. That was the moment, minute 4, that something snapped. Not just in the hearing room, in the public, in the myth that justice was slow but fair. Jasmine wasn't chasing headlines. She was dragging truth from its grave. And it all began with 17 seconds. One envelope, one name, and one woman they told to sit down. But she didn't. She stood. And the room? It forgot how to breathe. The oversight chamber, designed for formality, used to long-winded nothingness and procedural yawns, was suddenly electric, suffocating. The kind of air you don't breathe, you brace against. Chairs that once held egos now held elbows clutching armrests, eyebrows furrowed, spines stiffened. Lungs held hostage between disbelief and dread. The long mahogany table in the center had seen decades of hearings, scandals, resignations, and cover-ups, but it had never seen this. Not this brand of truth, unapologetic, bone-deep, female in black. Jasmine Crockett didn't just fill the room. She haunted it. She was the moment before the car crash, the shiver that makes you grip the wheel tighter, even though you don't know why. Behind legal folders, staffers exchanged panicked glances. Text messages were flying beneath the table, thumbs trembling as they tapped out one-word questions to crisis teams. She has it? Is that real? Abort? The microphones, perched like vultures waiting for sound bites, suddenly sounded too loud, too close, as if they too were afraid of what they might pick up. One let out a slight static crackle and a junior intern jumped like it was a gunshot. Even the water pitchers had stilled, untouched, their condensation slowly dripping like sweat off the foreheads of men who once thought they were untouchable. At the far end of the chamber, a young legal assistant, barely 24, Harvard pin still fresh on his lapel, wiped his palms on his trousers twice. Then again, he wasn't sweating because it was hot. He was sweating because he understood that this wasn't just a misstep or a PR nightmare. It was something older and more dangerous. It was righteous fury wrapped in cold evidence. And still, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was an instrument, played with intent, not hesitation. She let the discomfort simmer, stretch, take root in every uncomfortable chair, in every overly tight collar. Her stillness was a warning. She was the storm's eye, that deadly quiet just before the sirens wail and windows explode. Trump hadn't moved, not physically at least, but his body spoke in other ways, his fingers now clenching the arms of his chair, white at the knuckles. His left foot, tapping involuntarily, betrayed the rhythm of a man calculating not strategy, but exit plans. His lawyer leaned in again, this time whispering with too much breath and too little control. Jasmine caught it. So did the camera. Because the cameras, they were no longer passive observers. They had become witnesses. C-SPAN, CNN, Fox, every lens in the room had found her face, her file, her fury. And they didn't blink. From the press gallery, a veteran journalist, known for breaking Watergate-era stories, leaned forward, pen hovering midair, breath audibly caught. "She's not bluffing," he mouthed to the reporter beside him. That reporter nodded once, slowly, eyes fixed on Jasmine like he was watching history tear through the seams of the present. And in the back row, where the audience sat in stifled rows, A woman with a service dog silently reached for her husband's hand. A Marine vet 3 tours in, he hadn't spoken much since the diagnosis. But his eyes, glazed but focused, locked on Jasmine. He hadn't blinked once since the name Freedom Properties was read aloud. That name had been on his VA rejection letter. Above it all, the chandeliers trembled slightly, not from wind, but from the collective exhale no one was ready to release. Somewhere, someone tried to cough and stopped halfway, like even their lungs didn't want to interrupt. Jasmine finally moved. Not much, just her fingertips grazing the edge of the envelope again, as if reminding the room, this is still only the beginning. A Republican congressman across the table, Whitaker, Georgia, loud old school, cleared his throat with false confidence. "Madam Chair, is this a stunt?" he barked, voice brittle. But it wasn't strength, it was fear wearing a red tie. He knew it. Jasmine knew it. The cameras definitely knew it. She didn't look at him. She looked straight down the barrel of the main broadcast lens and said, not loudly, but with razor precision, "Only if laundering veterans' blood money into marble estates is considered theater." He shut up. And suddenly, everything shifted again. Not violently, not obviously, but enough for the walls to feel closer, enough for the committee members to realize they weren't watching a presentation. They were watching a reckoning dressed in calm. Jasmine Crockett, still silent, still composed, glanced toward the document camera. She hadn't even shown them everything yet. She hadn't shown them the satellite footage, the tax forms, the photo of the boy on the balcony, the utility bills, the marble receipt from Italy. But they were already sweating like she had. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even raised a finger. But she had raised the stake. And now the room was trembling, not because it feared chaos, but because it finally recognized order. And Jasmine was the order coming for them. The storm hadn't hit yet. But every man in that chamber could already hear the wind screaming her name. Then came the lightning. Without breaking eye contact with the committee, Jasmine tapped her tablet once. A split-second delay, then every monitor's arm in the chamber lit up. Not with charts, not with bullet points, but with a single image that arrested every breath in the room. A 3-story villa, perched like a crown above the still waters of Lake Bled in Slovenia. White marble columns, gold-accented balconies, a private helipad, and carved into the arched entryway, above grand double doors, 2 initials in obsidian stone, BT. There was no voiceover, no dramatic sting, just the raw silence of a nation's moral compass spinning wildly off axis. The image hovered there, full screen. You could almost smell the imported stone, feel the arrogance in every perfectly sculpted line. It was palatial, too luxurious to be legal, too tasteful to be honest. Jasmine waited, let them stare, let them feel it. Then, her voice calm and clipped. "This is what $12 million buys when veterans are told the country can't afford wheelchairs." No one moved. But inside their heads, you could hear the scrambling, scrambling, staffers mentally reviewing years of budgets, talking points collapsing like scaffolding in a hurricane. The illusion that this was just another partisan attack was gone, shattered, because marble doesn't lie and villas don't build themselves. She tapped again. Up came the official Slovenian property registry. Owner, Freedom Properties USA. Religious Restoration Division. Tax status, faith-based exemption. Legacy, initiative, acquisition, date, July 4th. A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. July 4th, not June 30th, not July 6th, but Independence Day. The symbolism was no accident. Jasmine made sure they understood that. While Americans were barbecuing in backyards, she said, her tone sharpening, while children lit sparklers and veterans held parades on aching legs, someone was wiring tax-exempt dollars across the Atlantic, so a privileged boy could bathe in marble and call it healing. One congressman's jaw visibly clenched. Another looked down, ashamed, or worse, complicit. But she wasn't done. Next came the internal wire transfer form. Freedom Properties Trust, Primorsa Holdings Limited. Memo, Interior Completion, Legacy Wing Transfer ID, 0412 FP SLO EAND. She highlighted the last three letters, IND. Short for independence, she said, or perhaps indulgence, depending on who you ask. Trump shifted in his seat again, then snapped at his attorney in a low growl picked up faintly by the mic. Jasmine didn't acknowledge it. She didn't have to. The paper was speaking louder than he ever could. Then she dropped the final blow of the set. A procurement invoice, dated precisely 3 days before the transaction, issued from Carrara Marble Works, Italy. The client? T Family Legacy Project. Shipment, 1,220 screw, Fuft, custom carved Bianco Carrara marble. Destination, Ljubljana, Slovenia. Billing address, Freedom Properties, USA. She stared at the paper, then up at the men in front of her, then into the camera. That marble, she said slowly, was paid for with funds originally allocated for the Patriot Aid Extension Act. The same program that sent James Keller, Vietnam veteran, double amputee, a rejection letter for home accessibility upgrades. They told him there was no money left. A low gasp escaped from the public gallery, and then silence again. Heavy, bruising, not the kind of silence that asks for a pause, the kind that dares you to speak and choke on your own words. She let it settle for exactly 8 seconds. Then, with a flick of her hand, pulled open a folded satellite map and placed it beneath the document camera. The map expanded across her desk like a crime scene diagram. Every line, every coordinate, every square meter accounted for. This, she said, tapping a red circled area, is the spa wing, complete with a private sauna, massage chamber, and imported Japanese soaking tubs. Another tap. And this is the BT balcony, the one seen in this photograph taken 6 weeks ago. Note the timestamp, the GPS metadata. This isn't speculation. This is digital fact. She looked at the room again. Tell me, gentlemen, which scripture authorizes private villas for spiritual renewal only accessible by helicopter? She didn't need an answer. No one dared offer one. Trump's jaw twitched. His hand gripped the table's edge. For the first time in his life, the power of silence wasn't in his control. It was in hers. And still, Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, not once. She didn't need to shout to shake a nation, because the image of that Slovenian villa, with its gold staircases and stained glass windows, had already done it for her. It wasn't just a house. It was a mirror. And what America saw in it wasn't just greed. It was betrayal, gilded in marble, enwrapped in a tax exemption. And Jasmine had only just begun. The second wave didn't come in the form of evidence or files. It came in the form of a man. The rear doors of the chamber opened slowly, not with urgency, but with the weight of a funeral procession. The silence parted, not for status, but for sacrifice. Fred Alden stepped through. Late 60s, shoulders slightly hunched, dressed in an old brown suit that had outlived more presidents than anyone in that room. He didn't carry notes. He carried a binder. The leather cracked, corners frayed, held not like a prop, but like a flag that had been folded too many times. He walked with a limp that told a longer story than any headline ever could. The kind of limp that doesn't ask for sympathy, the kind that says, I've already paid. Jasmine stood, not out of protocol, but out of reverence. The audience followed. Even a few on the committee instinctively rose, unsure if it was obligation or guilt. Fred Alden took his seat at the witness table. He didn't adjust the microphone. He didn't clear his throat. He just looked up at the room with eyes that had watched a coffin lower into desert dirt in Mosul and said, My name is Fred Alden. I'm the father of Staff Sergeant Caleb Alden. 3 tours, Bronze Star, KIA in 2006. He was 26. No one breathed. He reached into his binder, pulled out a photo, creased, faded, edges torn by time. It showed a young man in desert fatigues grinning despite the sand in his teeth, a smile built on purpose. He died in Iraq, not because he wanted to, but because he believed the country was worth protecting. That service mattered. Fred's voice didn't crack. It didn't tremble. It landed like slow punches to the gut. After Caleb passed, I retired early, joined Freedom Properties as an accountant, because I believed in its mission, helping wounded veterans transition home, build lives, find hope. He paused. I thought I was building something sacred, until I found the ledger entry. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, gently encouraging. Fred nodded and continued, opening his binder to a marked page, lifting it like a blade. On July 4th, 2023, exactly 17 years after I received my son's casket, Freedom Properties rerouted $12 million through a European holding company. I asked questions. The next day, I was locked out of my accounts. The day after that, I was let go. No explanation, no thanks, just a non-disclosure agreement and a silent escort out of the building. You could hear the creak of the leather chair beneath him as he shifted. They used my son's face on a brochure, Fred said, voice rising for the first time. They printed his smile next to a banner that said, "Honor through healing." That same year, they used that fundraising money to install imported marble in a spa across the Atlantic. He placed the brochure on the table, face up, Caleb's image staring straight into the soul of the room. I gave this country everything. I gave it my son, and they gave that memory a price tag. Someone in the press gallery gasped. A hand went to a mouth. The Marine in the audience from earlier stood slowly, hat in hand, as if saluting not the man, but the rage he had every right to feel. Jasmine's voice came low, steady. Mr. Alden, did anyone in Freedom Properties ever provide documentation for that transaction? Fred shook his head. No, they buried it under what they called a legacy pivot. When I asked what that meant, they said it was part of the Next Gen Patriot Investment Initiative. Sounded like healing. Turned out it was high-gloss theft. Jasmine nodded. Do you have copies of what you found? Fred opened his binder again. Email chains, marked up memos, meeting minutes with strategic redirects. A calendar with one date circled in red, redirect day. Beneath it, the words EU movement confirmed. He lifted one page with shaking hands. This one matters, he said, holding it up. It's the day they approved the payment, the same day they denied funding to a quadriplegic veteran I personally worked with for months. His name was Carlos. He asked for adaptive driving gear. Got a letter saying budget unavailable. Fred inhaled deeply. Then I watched invoices come in for limestone soaking tubs, Italian chrome fixtures, and imported lavender oil. The word lavender hit harder than any explosive revelation. It was soft, absurd, insulting. Like watching someone take communion with wine bought from stolen pensions. Fred set down the last paper and folded his hands. They called it a retreat, he said, but there were no soldiers, no healing, just curtains that cost more than my entire annual pension. Then he looked up, straight into the camera. You can call this a hearing, but I call it a reckoning. And I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to ask one question. If my son gave his life for this country, who gave these men permission to spend it? The room collapsed into silence so pure it could shatter glass. Jasmine closed her eyes briefly. Then she said, more to the nation than the room, that wasn't testimony. That was truth with a scar. And Fred Alden, the man they tried to silence with a severance check and a non-disclosure agreement, sat back in his chair, not in triumph, not in peace, but in defiance. He didn't cry, because his tears weren't meant to mourn. They were meant to indict, and the jury had just heard its opening statement. But as Fred Alden stepped away from the mic, the chamber still raw with his truth, Jasmine wasn't finished, not by a mile. The villa was the marble mask. Fred had shown the blood beneath it. Now came the rot inside the soul, the betrayal dressed in robes and scripture. The doors opened again, this time softer. A different kind of presence walked in, not limping, not frail, but weighed down by something far heavier than age, disillusionment. Reverend Miriam Porter, Former senior chaplain, Freedom Properties. 40 years of ministry, 20 of them spent serving homeless veterans and trauma-stricken soldiers across the Midwest. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't an accountant. She was at one time the conscience of the mission, until the mission changed, and they decided they no longer needed a conscience. She took her seat slowly, folding her hands over a worn Bible whose cover had faded from black to ash gray. The room quieted again. My dad again, not because they expected thunder, but because sometimes whispers cut deeper. I was ordained in 1982, she began, her voice calm, worn, like gravel under a hymn. I baptized the children of soldiers. I prayed with whereas after final phone calls. I held the hands of men who couldn't sleep without reliving the muzzle flash. She paused, blinked once, no tears. When I joined Freedom Properties in 2009, we held prayer circles under bridges. We brought meals to shelters. We gave socks and sermons in the same breath. And it mattered. It saved lives. But then her voice dropped. Barely perceptible, yet undeniable. Until the gospel was replaced with a budget forecast. She reached into her canvas satchel and pulled out a glossy event invitation. It shimmered beneath the document camera. A gold-trimmed card with embossed lettering. Freedom Gala, a legacy evening. Faith, freedom, future. Location, Waldorf Astoria Ballroom, featuring VIP, wine pairing with the T family. The irony stung like lemon on open skin. That's when I knew, she said, voice a little thinner now. The only altar they were building was for donors. She unfolded another flyer, this one less polished. An internal schedule with strike-throughs. Where it once read PTSD, healing workshop, someone had typed over it, Legacy Impact Luncheon, Donor Engagement Tier 3, no mention of veterans, no mention of chaplains, just head counts, catering preferences, and gift bag sponsors. She held the paper like it was a photograph of someone she once loved, now unrecognizable. They told me our mission was evolving, that healing could now be branded, that the Holy Spirit needed a donor packet. A murmur crept along the back row, uneasy. A few heads bowed, but not in prayer. They asked me to wear makeup, to smile more, to stop quoting scripture during opening remarks, just thank the legacy patrons and keep it non-denominational. I was no longer Reverend Porter. I was spiritual programs liaison, a line item, a dressed-up placeholder for the smell of sincerity. She reached for the final page, a termination letter, dated March 3rd, 2023. Reason, misalignment with evolving vision. She looked up then, right at the committee, and this time her voice did rise, not in volume but in conviction. Do you know what it means to lose your faith in a building where you're supposed to restore it for others? What it feels like when the cross you once wore becomes a brand logo? She turned to the camera. Her eyes didn't shake. They shut down our Detroit shelter the same week they signed a marble import order for Slovenia. The same month we told 10 veterans in Phoenix there were no more funds for trauma counseling. And not once did they mention these changes in our board meetings, because the board had become them. She let the silence hold. Then she unclipped her necklace, a simple wooden cross, sanded soft by years of wear, and laid it on the table. This used to be enough, she whispered. Now I wonder how many men wore this same symbol, while wiring 12 million in a spa tiles and villa balconies. One of the aides behind the panel shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Jasmine didn't blink. Reverend Porter, she asked softly, what would you say, as a minister, the new mission of Freedom Properties became? Miriam didn't hesitate. To sanctify greed, to baptize theft in the language of legacy, and to hang scripture like wallpaper over a vault. Her words cracked the veneer of politeness that the chamber had clung to since the beginning. She looked again to the lens. If God's name can be used to launder this kind of corruption, what sacred space is left in this country that can't be bought? The question landed like a judge's gavel, not shouted, not performed, just asked. Because somewhere deep down, every person watching already knew the answer. As Miriam stood, she left the cross behind on the witness table. Not as a prop, not as a symbol, and as evidence of us. The room watched her walk out in silence. Jasmine looked at the empty chair, then at the cameras. She didn't lose her faith. She just stopped letting others counterfeit it. And with that, the storm pressed forward. Because if marble was the currency and silence was the strategy, then faith was the shield. And Reverend Porter had just cracked it clean in half. What came next wasn't thunder. It was something colder, sharper. A revelation not built on ideology or faith, but bloodline. Jasmine Crockett stood once again, this time not as a question, but as an answer. Her voice didn't need to rise. The stillness in the room carried her words like gospel. There's one more name, she said, tapping her tablet. A name that appears not in deeds or donations, but in deposits. The monitors lit up again, this time with a single document. IRS Form 1099, MIS. Recipient, Baron William Trump, payer, Freedom Properties Nonprofit Trust, amount, $1,421,000. Description, consulting services, strategic youth outreach. A collective stillness swept the chamber. Not shock, something worse. Recognition. The kind of pause that follows a slap, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed everything you feared. Jasmine looked down at the paper, then up at the committee. Let's be clear, she said. Baron Trump, age 19, enrolled as a student, was paid nearly $1.5 million for strategic youth outreach on behalf of a faith-based nonprofit. She took a step forward. No evidence of workshops, no lectures, no initiatives, just a payment, a title, and a name big enough to hide behind. She tapped again. An internal memo blinked onto the screen. Subject, Youth Inclusion Layer. Excerpt, add BT as junior advisor, Gen Z Optics improved tax-exempt argument. Layering provides narrative buffer if FOIA exposure occurs. Gasps were audible now, not from the press, from the aides, those who knew this language. This wasn't policy. This was architecture. And the bricks were names, the mortar was manipulation. Jasmine turned to the camera, her voice like ice beneath steel. They didn't hire a consultant. They hired a human shield, and they dressed him in legacy. She paused, then pulled up a second document, an email string. Sender, legal@trumpfoundation.org. Recipient, btrump@student.washington.edu. Subject, final confirmation, Primorso wire transfer. Body, please confirm transaction for Phase 3 development and amendment. Signature required. Reply, confirmed, proceed, BT. Another screen lit up with metadata, timestamp, IP address and address, MAC address, all traced to a dormitory room on the campus of the International School of Washington. One login, one location, one user. She turned toward the former president, who now sat visibly rigid. You claimed your son had no part in this, that he was just a student, a bystander. Jasmine stepped to the document camera and placed a photo beneath it. A close-up image of Baron Trump, standing barefoot on the villa balcony, a tablet in his left hand, the initials BT carved into the stone behind him. On the tablet screen, partially visible, a banking app open with a transfer confirmation. No bystander leaves fingerprints on marble. Trump stirred. He's a child, he snapped. You're dragging a kid into politics. Jasmine didn't even flinch. Then why, she said slowly, did your legal team file an emergency gag order 6 days ago to suppress this email thread? The question was a hammer. The silence that followed was the fracture. She pulled up one final file, a corporate PowerPoint deck. Title slide, Project Gold Shield, Asset Structuring for Heirs. Slide 3, begin title layering before age 18. Case study B. Trump. The screen flickered, then zoomed in. Baron Trump wasn't an accident, Jasmine said. He was a strategy, a legacy camouflage. A boy turned into paperwork so the guilt would wear a soft face and the taxes would look away. Her tone didn't tremble. Her eyes never left the lens. You didn't let him serve, she continued. You didn't let him speak. You let him cover. For you. While soldiers like Caleb Alden were buried, your son signed off on spas. Someone in the gallery stifled a sob. One of the interns turned away. Jasmine remained still. This isn't about punishment, she said. It's about responsibility, and whether the children of power can inherit protection without ever earning accountability. She leaned closer to the mic, her final words low, deliberate. You didn't make your son a philanthropist. You made him a firewall. And with that, she sat back down, while the entire chamber stared at the shattered mirror now reflecting their own silence. Because when the name of a child becomes a ledger line, the innocence doesn't protect the family. It condemns them, line by line, signature by signature, until the mask of legacy can no longer hide the cost of privilege. But Jasmine knew the signatures were only the surface. To expose a system, you couldn't stop at the puppet. You had to show the strings. And worse, the lesson plan. She stood again, slower this time, not with the rhythm of accusation, but the weight of revelation. Her fingers moved deliberately across the tablet in front of her, and the screens in the chamber blinked awake once more. This time it wasn't a wire transfer. It wasn't a villa. It was a slide deck. Black background, white serif font, corporate, sterile, chilling. Project Gold Shield, internal training document. Trump Foundation. Private Strategy Division. Subhead, Asset Structuring for Next Generation Legacy Holders. The chamber sat still, paralyzed by the ordinariness of it. It looked like a business school case study, but each line hit like a confession dressed in tax code. Slide 1. Inheritance is vulnerability without insulation. Slide 2. Trust structuring must begin before public exposure. Slide 3. Begin title layering by age 17. Case study, B. Trump. The name wasn't hidden, it wasn't masked, it wasn't coded. It was there, bold, unapologetic, intentional. Jasmine let it hang in the air like the last breath before a guilty verdict. They didn't stumble into corruption, she said, voice razor sharp. They studied it, taught it, packaged it. She advanced to the next slide. A chart appeared, concentric circles labeled with terms like shell visibility buffer, philanthropic cover radius, and tax identity fracturing. Now at the center, one phrase, dynastic obfuscation module. This isn't estate planning, Jasmine continued. This is inheritance laundering disguised as patriotism. Then she tapped again. The screen shifted to a slide titled Heir Development Timeline, Phase 1, Passive Identity Framing. Underneath were bullet points. Curate online footprint around faith, education, and charitable proximity. Limit political statements. Maintain benevolent ambiguity. Affix name to nonprofit holdings without operational exposure. The final bullet point stopped the room cold. Emotional leverage layer. Use heir's youth as narrative shield during audits or media escalation. Gasps. Audible, uncontrollable. Not just from the audience, but from the elected officials seated on the dais. A senator from Arizona covered his mouth. Another whispered something to her aide, who looked back in disbelief. This wasn't strategy. This was indoctrination. Not how to lead, but how to hide behind legacy. Jasmine stepped forward, never breaking eye contact with the room. This was never about protecting a child, she said. This was about training a shield to take the heat before the house catches fire. She brought up one last slide, a high-resolution scan of a printed agenda for a private seminar titled Legacy Protection Weekend, T Family Invite Only. Guest list, redacted, location, undisclosed. But one line at the bottom made the room freeze entirely. Session 4, role play, press handling, and heirs are named in foreign asset trails. Facilitator, Caleb Varelli trainee, B. Trump. That name again, not in headlines, not in scandal, in practice. Trump shifted, trying to speak, but Jasmine was already talking. You didn't protect your son, Mr. Trump, she said. You prepared him for a future of loopholes and laundering. You handed him marble and told him it was mission. You gave him tax law and called it destiny. Her voice didn't tremble. It commanded. America raises soldiers. Your empire raises shields. Then she paused, letting that sentence settle, sear, etch itself into the walls of the chamber. She turned to the committee. This isn't about children. It's about the architecture of impunity, taught early, practiced quietly, passed down like a family heirloom. This is what happens when power believes it deserves no consequence. She leaned into the microphone again. Not all legacy is lineage. Some of it is liability dressed in baby photos and trust funds. The screen behind her faded to black, but the echoes lingered, not just in the room, but in the minds of every parent watching across the country. Every teacher, every veteran, every believer in merit who just realized they'd been competing with dynasties built on deception, disguised as destiny. Jasmine returned to her seat, calm, contained. And the chamber, once a theater of decorum, now sat in the silence of scorched ground. The illusion had cracked. Because this wasn't just about a boy, it was about a blueprint. And now the nation had seen the curriculum. But even blueprints need buildings. And buildings don't rise from spreadsheets alone. Someone had to sign the deeds, coordinate the contractors, move the marble. Someone somewhere had made it real. Jasmine knew the architecture of corruption rarely lives in confessionals. It lives in whispers, in deleted emails, in international phone calls that never show up on a bill. But occasionally, if you listen closely, truth leaks through the cracks. And this time, it had a name. The chamber doors opened again, but this time there was no dramatic pause, no theatrical entrance. Just a woman in a gray coat, collar turned up, hands clutching a leather folder like it was the only solid thing left in her world. Her name was Elena Merrick, a Slovenian real estate broker, middle-aged, unassuming, but the weight she carried wasn't in her posture, it was in her eyes. The kind of gaze that comes from seeing something you weren't supposed to and surviving long enough to regret it. She took her seat at the witness table without a sound. Jasmine introduced her softly. Ms. Merrick is here under protection. What she brings us today is not politics, it's proximity. The lights dimmed slightly as Elena's face appeared on the monitors. She looked directly at the committee, then the press, and finally at the lens. My name is Elena Merrick. I have worked in real estate in Ljubljana for over 20 years. I have brokered hundreds of transactions, villas, embassies, government retreats. I know when something feels normal. This did not. She opened her folder and pulled out a scanned contract. Jasmine placed it beneath the document camera. Client name, FP Legacy Holdings Transaction Code, SLO 452DBT, property, 3-story villa, Lake Bled purchase, type, private non-disclosure acquisition, special clause, no press disclosure, no signage, no public listing. Elena continued, her voice steady but increasingly brittle. When I received the request, it came through a third-party American firm. They insisted the buyers were cultural ambassadors seeking to create an interfaith dialogue retreat. It sounded noble. It sounded beautiful. But it wasn't true. She turned the page. Payment came in case. 3 installment. Delivered by couriers who never gave names. The 3rd installment came with a thank you card. It was unsigned, but it smelled of imported perfume, very expensive. It smelled foreign. Someone in the gallery chuckled nervously. Elena didn't flinch. I asked for legal documentation. They gave me shell companies, Delaware, Cyprus. Then came the threats. She shifted in her seat. My tires were slashed. My office window broken. One morning, my dog, a Labrador I had raised from a pup, was poisoned. I was told to stop asking questions, that everything was taken care of in Washington. Gasps rippled through the audience. Not the loud kind, just the small, horrified intakes of breath from people who thought they had heard everything already. Jasmine spoke gently. Miss Merrick, did you know who the true buyer was? Elena shook her head. No, Not until a contractor showed me a work order signed BT. When I asked if that stood for Baron Trump, he laughed. And then he said something I will never forget. She looked straight into the camera now. No translator, no notes. In America, everything is a charity. If you smile while you lie. The words struck like a hammer on crystal, shattering the illusion not just of legality, but of morality. Jasmine tapped her screen. Up came the flight manifest. A private Gulfstream jet landing in Ljubljana 5 days before the final payment. 3 passengers, Melania Trump, Baron Trump, and Caleb Varelli, the same financial strategist who drafted the legacy training slides, the same man who built the shell companies, the same man photographed at the villa 2 weeks later. Jasmine's voice sharpened. Ms. Merrick, did anyone involved in this transaction ever mention Freedom Properties? Elena nodded. Only once. A clerk processing documents whispered it to me in the corridor. She said they call it Freedom, but they build behind locked gates. Elena placed one last page beneath the camera. A maintenance request signed by Baron Trump for installation of biometric locks, encrypted surveillance, and something labeled gold leaf finish for prayer alcove. Jasmine turned to the committee, her voice lower now, more intimate. They built a sanctuary, not for faith, not for healing, but for hiding, behind a fake mission, a rebranded gospel, and a 19-year-old boy who was told legacy means never having to answer. She looked back at Elena. Thank you for your courage. Elena said nothing. She just nodded, eyes glassy, hands trembling as she closed her folder. The room didn't erupt, it didn't clap, it didn't shout, it simply absorbed. Because when a foreign broker shows more integrity than the men who wrote the checks, you don't just have a scandal, you have a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had made sure it had a witness. But reckoning has a face, and Jasmine knew the final witness would not walk through any door. He would appear on a screen. At 3:14 p.m., the lights in the oversight chamber dimmed slightly, and a monitor descended from the ceiling like a final judgment. Static flickered, then cleared. There he was, Baron William Trump, broadcast live from a secure location, dressed in a navy blazer and white button-up shirt, seated before a wall of antique books and soft lighting that tried to whisper innocence. He looked older than the photos, sharper, more careful, his posture straight, his hands folded on the table. A performance of humility, but his eyes were rehearsed. The room waited. Jasmine said nothing. She let the silence press against him like gravity. Finally, Baron spoke. Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I understand the seriousness of this matter, but I want to say this clearly. Everything I did because adults told me to. I followed the instructions of people I trusted. I signed what they gave me. I didn't know it was wrong. It was delivered with just the right amount of tremble, just enough distance, a crafted confession without the spine of consequence. Jasmine leaned forward, but didn't move to speak just yet. She studied him, studied the angles, the measured breath, the half-lowered lashes, the soft tone, not too defiant, not too broken. Exactly what you would expect from someone trained to look guilty, but not culpable. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Trump, she began, her voice low, even, surgical. How old were you when you signed the wire confirmation for the Phase 3 payment to Primorsa Holdings? Baron hesitated. 19. And were you enrolled at the time in the International School of Washington? Yes, I was. Were you aware that your student email address was used to authorize multiple overseas transfers linked to Freedom Properties' European acquisitions? He blinked. I was told to confirm things. I didn't ask questions. Jasmine nodded slowly. No one chooses the name they're born with, she said, voice softer now. But we all choose what we do with it. Baron looked down. A pause. Calculated. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, Tom, he said. I didn't understand the structure. The companies, the accounts, it was all confusing. They said it was for our family's legacy, for something good. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained calm. Mr. Trump, did you believe veterans' aid funds were being used to buy imported marble for a villa you visited? His breath caught. No, I didn't think about it like that. That's the problem, she replied. You didn't think, but you signed, you confirmed, you benefited. And while wounded soldiers were denied wheelchairs, you sat on heated marble floors overlooking a lake they will never walk beside. The weight of that line hung in the air, not accusatory, not cruel, just undeniable. Barron straightened slightly, bracing. I was trying to make my family proud, he said, voice cracking just enough to register. I didn't ask to be a part of this. You didn't ask, Jasmine repeated, but you agreed, you accepted. And when the paperwork came, you didn't question the marble or the mission or the missing millions. You just tapped, confirm. A stillness overtook the chamber. Not dramatic, just tight. Mr. Trump, she continued, do you understand that your name was not used as a token of trust, but as a shield? You were not recruited to build legacy. You were trained to absorb liability. Barron looked at the camera, and for the first time he didn't blink. I didn't know what else to do, he whispered. And Jasmine, not angry, not triumphant, simply nodded. That, she said, is what makes it worse. She stood then, taking a slow step toward the monitor. When power is passed down like inheritance, unearned and unquestioned, it doesn't just protect the guilty. It creates a new generation of silence. You weren't corrupted. You were coached. The screens behind her lit up again with the training slides. Begin title shielding by age 17. Use youth optics to deflect scrutiny. Barron's face flickered beside those phrases, his live image next to the mechanics of his grooming. You were born into a fortress, Mr. Trump. And when the walls cracked, they used you to patch the leaks. But innocence isn't immunity, especially when it signs the checks. Barron looked smaller now, not cornered, just seen, fully. Jasmine turned back to the committee. This isn't about punishing a boy. It's about confronting a system that teaches boys how to wear impunity like a last name. She sat down. The screen went dark. Barron's face disappeared into pixels, and the room for a moment felt colder. Because no one had shouted, no one had stormed out, no verdict had been read, but something irreversible had happened. For the first time, the air had been made to answer, not with rage, not with denial, but with the dull, sinking recognition. That legacy without conscience is just privilege in a tailored suit. And no inheritance can protect you from a truth that finally learns how to speak. But truth, once spoken, doesn't settle. It echoes. It spreads. And on a quiet Tuesday evening, less than 12 hours after Barron Trump's broadcast, it detonated. The clip wasn't edited. It didn't need to be. It was a grainy live stream capture from a back corner of the chamber. No dramatic angles, no polished lighting, just a single, unshaken image. James Keller, retired Marine, reading a government letter aloud with shaking hands and too much dignity for the humiliation it contained. We regret to inform you that your request for outpatient care under the Patriot Aid Extension Fund has been denied. Funding currently unavailable. The silence afterwards said everything. And then, just barely picked it up in the background, his daughter's voice, hoarse with restraint. My father deserved more than a villa. That line became a match. The clip hit 100,000 views in 30 minutes. 1 million by sunrise. By noon, it was being broadcast on morning shows next to footage of the Slovenian mansion, photos of Barron in linen slacks, and receipts of Freedom Properties marble shipments. Late-night hosts recited the denial letter live, with a kind of anger rarely seen outside breaking war footage. It was no longer just a scandal. It was a betrayal people could feel in their knees. In Detroit, teachers marched with handmade signs that read, "Classrooms, not columns." My salary wouldn't cover one marble stair. In Dallas, a line of veterans stood silently outside a federal building, each holding a printed rejection letter overhead. Rain bleeding the ink but not the message. In rural Ohio, the Keller family's front yard filled with letters from strangers, nurses, mechanics, retired postal workers, each one echoing the same refrain. You weren't the only one they told no. By week's end, Had at Villa for One had become more than a hashtag. It was a thunderclap in the nation's conscience. It was painted on city walls in Chicago. It was projected onto the Capitol steps in bold white light. It was tattooed onto the bicep of a retired airborne sergeant in Georgia. And as America watched the movement swell, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't give interviews. She didn't post statements. Because the truth was now doing the work for her. And the truth had teeth. It wasn't just the image of a luxury bathtub on a hillside in Slovenia. It was the math. The $12 million carved from hearts, folded into nonprofit jargon, and poured into imported tile while VA clinics laid off trauma therapists. It was the absurdity of watching a 19-year-old heir confirm wire transfers while 68-year-old veterans waited 6 months for a new wheelchair battery. It was Fred Alden's binder, Reverend Porter's wooden cross, Elena Merrick's poisoned dog. It was the accumulation of rot finally made visible. The committee chamber, once a tomb for congressional stalling, had become a forge, and Jasmine had struck the match, but it was the country that carried the flame. Cable networks changed their chyrons overnight, from alleged misuse of funds to America's inheritance crisis. When charity becomes camouflage. Across social media, clips of Jasmine's questioning went viral not for their theatrics, but for their precision. One line repeated like a chant, "You didn't raise a philanthropist, you raised a firewall." It hit because people knew the feeling of being told there was nothing left. Nothing left for hospitals or schools or housing. And now they knew exactly where that nothing had gone. The backlash wasn't confined to headlines. Donors began pulling out of Freedom Properties. Religious institutions issued statements of disavowal. The IRS, under mounting public pressure, reopened all audit decisions involving the nonprofit within the last 5 years. And quietly, subpoenas began to fly. But still, Jasmine stayed silent. She didn't need to speak because the country had finally started listening. And what they were hearing wasn't partisan. It wasn't left or right. It was personal. This was no longer a case file. It was a mirror. And for the first time in decades, Americans weren't just angry. They were ashamed. Not because they had failed, but because they had trusted. And that trust had been bought. With gold faucets, stone walls, and a last name they were told to revere. Because when a country builds a villa for one, it leaves the many out in the cold. And this time they were ready to storm the gates. But the gates didn't creak open. They crumbled. The last day of hearings arrived not with spectacle, but with a silence that felt final. There were no chants in the hallway, no camera flashes chasing answers. Inside the chamber, the seats were filled, but the air was different, thinner, more aware. It was no longer just a proceeding, it was a post-mortem. Trump sat at the far end of the table. His tie was perfect, his face unreadable. But his hands, once so animated, so dismissive, now folded, unmoving. The oxygen he once sucked from every room no longer belonged to him. Not after the villa, not after the marble, not after the child, the church, the cross. And when the gavel banged for adjournment, he didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't perform. He simply stood and walked out. No entourage trailing like royalty, no defiant spin to the press. Just a former president walking into history with no words left that hadn't already been disproven. He disappeared through the exit like a closing chapter. And Jasmine, she didn't give victory speeches, didn't sit down for Sunday morning interviews. The country wanted sound bites. She gave them silence. Because her work had never been about the performance. It was about the echo that followed. 2 days later, she was seen walking alone into a rundown public school in Detroit's West Side. No cameras, no podium, just her carrying 3 canvas tote bags filled with secondhand books and 2 sets of replacement classroom globes she'd bought herself after reading that their maps still showed East and West Germany. She met the teachers in a hallway where ceiling tiles sagged and the heat clicked off mid-sentence. I heard your library got downsized, she said, handing over the bags. One of the teachers, a woman in her 60s with chalk on her fingertips, looked like she was about to cry. Jasmine smiled, soft but stony. This is where legacy actually lives, she said. Not behind stone gates, but behind doors that still creak when you push them. Later that day, a student asked her why she wasn't in D.C., where the action was. Jasmine knelt down, looked the girl in the eye, and answered without pause. The hearing didn't break America, she said, but silence inside the system. That's the real villain. Those words traveled further than any headline. A teacher posted them on her bulletin board. A parent in Milwaukee screen printed them on T-shirts. By Friday, they were spray painted onto the side of a shuttered library in Baltimore. Silence inside the system is the real villain. Because people weren't just angry anymore. They were awake. An awakening is irreversible. Congress issued a rare joint resolution to investigate nonprofit tax abuse. Audits were reopened. Shell foundations dissolved under pressure. The Board of Freedom Properties resigned en masse. Foreign governments began freezing accounts. Subpoenas landed like hail. But Jasmine didn't follow the paper trail to its final decimal. She followed it to a church basement in Ohio, where widows still run food banks for veterans whose checks never came. She followed it to a clinic in El Paso, where volunteers learned how to file disability claims faster than the VA itself. She followed it to places where legacy doesn't wear cufflinks, it wears boots and grief, and 20-year-old uniforms folded into drawers no one dares open anymore. She showed up where marble never would. Because this wasn't about destroying a name. It was about giving back the names of those who had been erased. Fred, James, Miriam, Elena, Caleb. Their stories didn't vanish after the cameras turned away. They spread, not like wildfire, but like memory. And memory, once awakened, refuses to go quietly. Jasmine never declared victory. She simply walked forward, one foot in front of the other, through the ashes of a broken architecture, holding nothing but a binder of truth in a country that had finally learned how to listen. Because reckoning isn't just about justice, it's about reflection. And some mirrors don't show your face. They show your failure to see the faces you ignored. That was never a courtroom, it was a mirror, and Jasmine Crockett was the one brave enough to hold it steady. But even mirrors have frames, and what came next wasn't emotional testimony. It wasn't another photo or witness or tearful father. It was paper, a document so ordinary in appearance it almost escaped notice, until Jasmine slid it beneath the camera, her gloved fingertips resting on the upper right corner like she was about to detonate something. The header was crisp, formal, presidential seal, White House watermark. Date, January 15th, 2021, 5 days before the end of Trump's presidency. Executive Order, Order 3983, Faith-Based Civic Renewal and Legacy Builder Classification Act. The words themselves didn't scream. They didn't need to. They were quiet, polished, drafted by lawyers and policy strategists who knew exactly how to tuck a dagger behind a velvet clause. But Jasmine knew how to read between the lines, how to listen for what wasn't said. She read aloud, line by line, reclassifies faith-based nonprofit initiatives as legacy-building institutions in recognition of their cultural preservation roles, permits discretion in reporting foreign real estate assets tied to approved legacy initiatives, expedites audit waivers for faith-backed cultural development projects. Then she let it breathe. Translated plainly, she said, her voice colder now, this order legalized laundering under the cover of charity. It gave religious nonprofits the ability to act like private banks. And it removed the need to tell anyone about it. And then came the final blow. She tapped to zoom, and there it was, in blue pen, slanted cursive in the right margin of the original draft. Use this to shield the family work, fast-track the villa. DJT gasps rippled through the room like a tremor under glass. Jasmine didn't speak for a moment. She didn't need to. The document spoke for itself. It always had, because paper doesn't cry. It doesn't lie. It just waits for someone brave enough to read it aloud. They didn't find a loophole, she said finally. They wrote one. And they wrote it with a signature wrapped in the flag, passed through in the last gasps of a presidency, and disguised as preservation. She paused again. Let the weight of it sit in the lungs. This order was never debated, never vetted, never passed through oversight. It was buried. And when asked what its purpose was, they cited civic renewal. She looked up from the page now. Tell me, what part of civic renewal involves hiding marble in another man's country while telling this one there's no money left to heal its wounded? The room had gone completely still. Trump was no longer present, but his handwriting, those 7 words scrawled casually in the margin, were louder than any defense he could have made. Use this to shield the family work. The truth had always been there, neatly filed, officially archived, waiting. Jasmine leaned into the microphone, not with anger, but with something even more powerful: clarity. This was never about a single transaction. It was about permission, about how easily a democracy can be rewritten when no one reads the fine print, about how the word faith can become armor and the word legacy can become a weapon. She reached forward and folded the document in half, not to hide it, but to close it, like a casket. Then she looked straight into the camera, not at the press, not at the committee, but into the homes of every American who had ever been told there was nothing left for them. Her voice dropped, soft but sharp enough to cut through any screen. This was never a story about a boy. It was a story about a nation that once knew how to be ashamed. She let the silence that followed burn, not fast but slow, like coal, like reckoning. No applause, no headlines screaming. Just that truth, now loose in the world, never to be folded back into silence again. Because documents don't bleed, but they remember. And this one had remembered everything. And that document, silent, unfeeling, undeniable, left behind more than signatures. It left a lesson, not just about corruption or privilege or the quiet violence of loopholes, but about vigilance. Because democracies don't collapse in a single moment. They erode line by line, exception by exception, until truth becomes optional and justice becomes ornamental. Until marble villas are built from the bones of forgotten promises. Jasmine Crockett didn't save the system. She exposed it, and in doing so reminded a weary country that shame isn't weakness. It's proof the heart still works. The real legacy isn't wealth, it's accountability. And if this nation still wants to call itself free, then its people must remember. Power is borrowed, trust is sacred, and silence is never neutral. If this story made you pause, don't just scroll past. Sit with it, let it ache, let it ask you what silence has cost. Share it, discuss it, send it to someone who still believes that power without accountability is the most dangerous inheritance of all. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where we don't chase headlines. We chase the truth that hides beneath them. Hit the bell, because the next story won't be comfortable. It'll be unfiltered, unforgiving, and it might just remind you what justice is supposed to sound like. This story is a fictional dramatization, rooted in real systems, real silence, and the real weight of complicity. Any resemblance to actual figures is either purely coincidental or deliberately reflective for public reckoning. Thanks for watching. Justice doesn't arrive wrapped in ceremony. It shows up when someone finally refuses to sit down. This is Harrison Stories.